All right, how's everybody doing today? Hotep, hey, this is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network. It is Sunday, November 6, 2022, and we are live. Hope everybody's doing well today. We're doing a special broadcast of the African History Network show. It is Sunday, November 6, 2022, and I'll be doing my radio show tonight as well. But I wanted to discuss this topic as I talked about on my show last Sunday. I would be speaking at a virtual environmental conference this past week, the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition Virtual 2020 Equity Summit. And I spoke there this past Wednesday and Friday, Wednesday, November 2nd, and Friday, November 4th. And some of the things we talked about was reparations for African Americans and strategies for reparations. And we also talked about the land back movement for Native Americans, the land back movement for Native Americans, and how similarities in some of the history of Native Americans and African Americans, and synergies in working together for Native Americans to get their land back and African Americans to get reparations. And I did. I was one of the panelists, and I talked about some of the things I talked about was Bacon's Rebellion of 1675 and 1676, as well as King Philip's War of 1676 in the colony of New England. And I also talked some about the Virginia slave codes of 1705. So we were very short for time. There were a number of people on the panel. So I said I would do a special broadcast because I spent a lot of time putting together the slides for my portion of the presentation. So I'll do a special broadcast and share this information with you. Also, I'll give you some information about classes taking place this week. Well, Monday, November 2nd, and Thursday, November 10th, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school, and from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement of Black Power, 1865 to 1968, okay? All right, so I want to, Bacon's Rebellion is something that's not talked about a lot. And today we'll deal with the idea of the origin of race. We'll talk about the Virginia slave codes of 1705. We'll deal with the fact that the African Moors were exempt from the Virginia slave codes, okay, and but not Negroes. And also we'll talk about the petition of the Free Sundry Moors of South Carolina in 1790, because all this history is connected. And Bacon's Rebellion, in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion, puts us on the trajectory of where we are today and dealing with racism. Okay. All right. So I want to go to my PowerPoint presentation here. Let me go to this here just a second. All right, so how many people are familiar with Bacon's Rebellion, named Bacon, who was a Virginia plantation owner, okay? So at the same time, King Philip's War is taking place in the colony of New England, and we'll talk about King Philip's War also. At the same time, this is taking place in the colony of New England. You have what's known as Bacon's Rebellion, taking place in the colony of Virginia. Okay. Now, Bacon's Rebellion, it takes place in 1676, and this was the last major uprising of enslaved Africans and white indentured servants in colonial Virginia. One consequence of the failed rebellion was the intensification of African slavery and the social separation of Africans and whites in Virginia, So blackpast.org has a good article dealing with Bacon's Rebellion. There were a number of different sources that I looked at for this information. Also, there's a good article at history.com as well. Okay, so Bacon's Rebellion was triggered when a grab for Native American lands was denied. Now, the origins of Bacon's Rebellion rested with the conquest of the Powhatan Native American Indian Confederation, 1644 to 1646, and the Confederation's lands being distributed to the English planter class, Despite their defeat, Indians or Native Americans formerly associated with the Confederation continued squatting on these lands, which caused the Virginia colonists to engage in warfare against them. Okay, now the military and political situation was made more complicated by the presence of African slaves who, along with white indentured servants, produced the colony's main crop, which was tobacco. So this is before cotton became king. Okay, cotton largely becomes king after 1794, after Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. Okay, and this the cotton gin greatly reduces the cost of producing cotton. It was a device that efficiently removed the seeds out of cotton. Okay, then in 1803 you had the Louisiana Purchase, and the U.S. gets 828,000 square miles of land for less than 3 cents an acre from France. And this is going to double the territory of the U.S. at the time. Okay, it's going to double the territory, and this gives more fertile land for crops to be grown, and is going to increase the need for enslaved African labor also. Okay, this is a result of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. All right, now, so at this time, 1676, tobacco is the main cash crop that is being grown. All right, now, planters looked down upon the African slaves, indentured servants, and landless freemen, both white and African or black, whom they called the Giddy Multitude, Giddy, during the decades of the 1650s and 1660s. A sizable number of indentured servants, both African and white, both white and black, who had completed their required indentured labor service, clamored for old Powhatan Native American land, as well, which was under the control of Governor William Berkeley at the time, who was the governor of the Virginia colony. Okay, and Governor William Berkeley and his planter class associates. Okay, so Nathaniel Bacon, who led this rebellion, was a wealthy Virginia planter. He declared himself the leader of the colony's former indentured servants, freemen, black and white, newly arrived landless immigrants from England, Scotland, or Ireland, okay, and enslaved Africans. So you have this rebellion that consists of about 500 men. And these oppressed people, enslaved African people, white indentured servants, freemen, both African and European, people who are free, newly arrived immigrants who didn't own land, coming from England, Scotland, and Ireland. They all banded together because they were all being exploited. The labor was being exploited. They all of whom bonded together because of their common exploitation on the large tobacco estates, the large tobacco plantations. All of them were being exploited by the same people. So they banded together, regardless of race, regardless of status, because they realized that they had a common oppressor. Okay. Now, on September 19th, 1676, on September 19th, 1676, Nathaniel Bacon and his followers, this rebellion, they returned to Jamestown, Virginia, and battled forces loyal to Governor William Berkeley. He forced Governor Berkeley and his followers to retreat, and then Nathaniel Bacon and his rebels burned down the town of Jamestown, Virginia. They burned down the town of Jamestown, Virginia. So there's a good article from history.com, the official website of the History Channel. This article right here, which deals with why America's first colonial rebels burned Jamestown to the ground. Why America's first colonial rebels burned Jamestown to the ground. Bacon's rebellion was triggered when a grab for Native American lands was denied. Okay. And it deals with this history that is a very pivotal time in history. And as a result of Bacon's rebellion, we're going to see the term white be introduced into the British colonies. And it's going to have a devastating effect. It's going to have a devastating impact. Okay. So check out this article here dealing with Bacon's rebellion also. Poor farmers have been hit hard by falling tobacco prices, and many of the borders of the colony's frontier wanted to expand westward. There, they faced threats from Native Americans intent on protecting their ancestral lands. When the colonists called on their governor for military support, he refused. Okay. Let me see. Let me go down to this part here. Okay, Nathaniel Bacon was declared a rebel by the governor, who was his cousin by marriage. Let's see. Okay, in September, came to a head. Governor Berkeley had been traveling throughout Virginia to recruit supporters of his own, and returned to Jamestown to issue a final proclamation condemning Nathaniel Bacon. In response, Nathaniel Bacon and his men rushed into Jamestown, Virginia, burning and pillaging as they went. On the night of September 19th, 1676, they torched the entire town of Jamestown, Virginia, burning it to the ground. As the embattled Governor Berkeley fled, Nathaniel Bacon's supporters terrorized what remained of the town of Jamestown, Virginia, and the governor's supporters. Okay, so the rebellion is going to be put down. The British Crown intervenes. News had taken months to travel to England, and King Charles II took until October of 1676 to respond. By then, Bacon's rebellion was falling to pieces. The day before Charles II's proclamation about the rebellion, Nathaniel Bacon died of dysentery. Without their leader, the rebels floundered. Governor William Berkeley, assisted by an English naval squad, soon defeated the remainder of the rebels, and Governor Berkeley returned to Jamestown. Okay, so read the rest of this article here, history.com, official website of the History Channel. Why America's first colonial rebels burned Jamestown to the ground. Okay. I don't know if this rebellion was the inspiration for the song, the roof is on fire. We don't need no water, but I would like to think that it was. If you're enough to remember that song. Okay. So let's continue here. Now, what happens is, as a result of Bacon's rebellion, there's a good piece from history.com called The History of the Idea of Race, the history of the idea of race. Now, toward the end of the 17th century, toward the end of the 1600s, labor from England began to diminish, and the colonies are faced with two major dilemmas. One was how to maintain control over the restless poor and the freedmen, okay, who seemed intent on the violent overthrow of the colony's leaders. The second dilemma that they were dealing with was how to obtain a controllable labor force as cheaply as possible. How to obtain a controllable labor force as cheaply as possible. So what was taking place in right about 1680, the economic conditions in England improve, and they're less English willing to come to the colonies to be indentured servants. So you have a declining amount of indentured servants, and they're going to start, and also at the same time you have they are enslaving Native Americans at this time also, but you're having a dwindling population of Native Americans, and they start to shift more to become more dependent on enslaving Africans and bringing more Africans into the colonies. Okay, so the second dilemma was how to obtain a controllable labor force as cheaply as possible. The colonial leaders found a solution to both problems. The colonial leaders found a solution to both problems. By the 1690s, so this is after Bacon's Rebellion ends in 1676. By the 1690s, they had divided the restless poor into categories reflecting their origins, homogenizing all Europeans into a white category, and instituting a system of permanent slavery for Africans, the most vulnerable members of the population. So they're instituting chattel slavery for African people, and for the Scottish and the Irish, for the English, for these Europeans, they introduced the term white right about 1681 in the colony of Virginia. This is going to spread through the other colonies, and they're trying to group all of the Europeans together. And what they want to do is break up the alliance between enslaved African people and still some African indentured servants. They want to break up that alliance between the Africans and the poor whites, the white indentured servants and poor whites. They want to break up that alliance. So they institute the term white to group all these Europeans together on the white team and separate them from Africans. And then what they're going to do is introduce the term Negro and really start using the term Negro, even though it was in the colonies, it wasn't widespread usage largely prior to Bacon's Rebellion. They're going to utilize the term Negro or Negro and use that to largely denote slaves as well. Okay. So if we look at, I want to look at Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr., page 40, 6th edition. Okay. How's everybody doing? Share this broadcast on your social media platforms. Invite your friends to tune in also. I want to look at page 40, 6th edition, chapter 2 of Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr. That's going to give some more background information on this history. Okay. And let me zoom in here on the part that I want. Okay, this is page 40. Now, if we scroll down to page 40, what Lerone Bennett Jr. is explaining here, this is Before the Mayflower. What he's explaining is how in the 1600s, prior to Bacon's Rebellion, prior to 1680, 1681, the term white was not used for the English or for Europeans. Okay, and the term Negro was not used for African people. So he goes, let's look at this here. He says, working together in this, hopefully you all can see this. Okay, let's blow this up. Okay. Working together in the same fields, sharing the same huts, the same situation, and the same grievances. The first black and white Americans, aristocrats accepted, developed strong bonds of sympathy and mutuality. They ran away together, played together, and revolted together. They ran away together, played together, and revolted together. Let me see how this looks. Okay. So can you all see that? They ran away together, played together, and revolted together. They made it. Let's see. There we go. They made it and married, siring a sizable mixed population. So you had it. So the mistake that people make is they think that when those 20 and odd Africans on the White Lion pirate ship, August 20th, 1619, are exchanged for food and water supplies, they think a system of slavery and racism already existed in the British colonies, and it did not. Codified slave laws didn't exist in the British colonies. At the 13 British colonies, codified slave laws didn't exist at that time. Okay. This is what's taking place. The term Negro was not largely being used at this point in time. In the process, the black and white servants, the majority of the colonial population, created a racial wonderland. Okay. In the process, the black and white servants, the majority of the colonial population, created a racial wonderland that seems somehow un-American in its lack of obsession about race and color. There was, to be sure, prejudice then, but it was largely English class prejudice, which was distributed without regard to race, creed, or color. There were also, needless to say, prejudiced individuals in the colony, and this is the fundamental difference between prejudice and racism. Their personal quirks and obsessions were not focused and directed by the organized will of a community. So you may have individuals that have their obsessions, their quirks, their biases, but it's not codified in the law, and it doesn't impact how the entire community acts towards these African people. Now, the basic division at that juncture was between servants and free people. This is in the 1600s in the British colonies that would become the United States. The basic division at that juncture was between servants and free people, and there were whites and blacks on both sides. There were free white people, there were free African people. You had cases of African people who owned white and black indentured servants. Okay, so you have all this taking place. The first colony to have codified slave laws is going to be Massachusetts in 1641. They come to Connecticut in 1650, come to Virginia about 1660, 1661. The codified slave laws are hitting the different colonies at different times. Okay, all this stuff didn't just happen all at one time. All right, all this stuff didn't just happen at one time. This evolves over time. This is why it's important to understand this chronology of history. Somebody posted Bacon's Rebellion. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon, 1676, the colony of Virginia. And in a minute, we're going to talk about King Philip's War of 1675, 1676 in the colony of New England. Okay, now, Let's continue. It appears from survive. Okay, so let me back up. The basic division at that juncture was between servants and free people, and there were whites and blacks on both sides of the line. Of all the improbable aspects of this situation, the oddest to modern blacks and whites, the oddest to modern African Americans and whites, is that white people did not seem to know that they were white in the 17th century, especially in the early 17th century prior to Bacon's Rebellion, the 1600s. It appears from surviving evidence that the first white colonists had no concept of themselves as quote unquote white people. The legal documents identified whites, who we will call white people. The legal documents identified them as Englishmen and or Christians. The word white, with its burden of arrogance and biological pride, developed late in the century, late in the 17th century, which is late in the 1600s, after Bacon's Rebellion. It's going to be introduced in the Virginia colony right about 1681, okay? Developed late in the century as a direct result of slavery and the organized debasement of blacks. The organized debasement of blacks. The same point can be made from the other side of the line. For a long time in colonial America, there was no legal name to focus white anxiety. The first blacks were called blackamoors, Moors, Negers, Negers, and Negars, Negars. The word negro or negro, which is a Spanish and Portuguese term for black, or it can mean a black thing, did not come into general use in Virginia until the latter part of the century, the latter part of the 17th century, which are the 1600s. That's going to be after Bacon's Rebellion. See, it's important to understand this chronology of history and actually what happened and the names we had throughout history before we were called Negroes. Okay, so he's talking about an African presence here in the colonies. And you had African Moors who were here before European settlers come here. Okay, now, if we go to, I'm gonna go to the next page. That's page 40. If we look at page 41 quickly here. A similar course of development was roughly characteristic of New York, the colony of New York, where the black settlement presided the English, and the name New York preceded where the black settlement preceded the English and the name New York. There are records from 1626 identifying 11 blacks. Now, this is when it was a Dutch colony called New Amsterdam. Okay, this is when it was a Dutch colony called New Amsterdam. The colony of New Amsterdam is going to become a British colony called New York. There are records from 1626 identifying 11 blacks or Africans, about 5% of the non-Indian population, who were servants of the Dutch West Indian Company, which is one of the slave trading companies that these Europeans had, organized and were financed by the wealthy, things like this, to go out and explore and conquer lands and capture Africans. And they were, like the English were enslaving Native Americans also. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But they're talking about the Dutch West Indian Company. The 11 African pioneers were males. Responding to the pleas of these males, the Dutch imported 3 women identified as Angolans in 1628. In 1644, some 18 years after their arrival, the Dutch Negroes, as they were called, filed a petition for freedom, the first black legal protest in America. The petition was granted by the Council of New Netherlands, which freed the Africans because they had, quote, served the company 17 or 18 years, end quote, and had been long since promised their freedom on the same footing as other free people in New Netherlands. Okay, the 11 Africans, 11 blacks listed in the petition were Paul de Angola, Big Manuel, Little Manuel, Manuel de Garrett, Derens, Simon Congo, Anthony Portuguese, Gracia, Peter Santome, John Francisco, Little Anthony, and John Fort Orange, all received parcels of land in what is now Greenwich Village. All received parcels of land in what is now Greenwich Village. What is essential to grasp about the first Africans in New York is that let me scroll over here, is that they stood on the same footing as white indentured servants from the very beginning. Quote, they had almost full freedom of motion and assembly, said James Weldon Johnson, who wrote this in Black Manhattan. James Weldon Johnson is the same man that wrote the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem. Quote, they were allowed to marry. Wives and daughters had legal protection against the lechery of masters, and they had the right to acquire and hold property, end quote. So this is in the 1600s. What has been outlined above with reference to New York and Virginia holds good also, though with minor variations for other colonies, including the colony of Pennsylvania, where the system of black indentured servitude was so rooted that black servants outnumbered black slaves at the time of the Revolution. So you're going to have black indentured servants during this time, as well as Africans. You have African indentured servants as well as African slaves. But they're going to start phasing out as you go further into the 1600s and then going to the 1700s. They're going to start phasing out the indentured servitude system and rely more and more on enslaving African people and enslaving them for perpetuity. And we're going to see the Virginia slave codes of 1705 play a huge part in this. Okay, so this is page 41 of Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr. Okay, now I want to go to, I want to go back to a PowerPoint presentation here, because when I spoke at Midwest Building Decarbonization Virtual 2022 Equity Summit on Wednesday, March 2nd and Friday, March 4th. Wednesday, November 2nd, and then Wednesday and Friday, November 4th. I didn't have a lot of time I spent a lot of time putting together these slides. So putting together this information, doing the research, I did not have a lot of time to get through the information, but the people were blown away by what I shared with them. Okay, now, let me go back to this here. Where am I? Okay, Bacon's Rebellion right here. Okay, before the Mayflower. Okay, so back to Bacon's Rebellion. Now, in the aftermath, how Bacon's Rebellion planted the seeds of race-based slavery. How Bacon's Rebellion planted the seeds of race-based slavery. In the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion, white planters reacted with alarm to the anger they had seen among the Black Virginians who had joined Bacon's Rebellion. Quote, the planters had not been able to control this rowdy labor force of servants and slaves, said historian Ira Berlin. He told this to PBS.org, Public Broadcasting System, PBS.org. But soon after Bacon's Rebellion, they increasingly distinguished between people of African descent and people of European descent. They enact laws which say that people of African descent are hereditary slaves. So this is chattel slavery. This is a consequence of Bacon's rebellion. Okay. Now there is there's an article from pbs.org, and I have a few articles here, so just bear with me. There's one dealing with the Virginia slave codes of 1705. Okay. And if we look at this here, because I have a lot of information on that. And when we look at the Virginia slave codes, we're going to see who is exempt from them. Let me pull this up from pbs.org. Okay. Let's look at this. All right, how's everybody doing? How y'all like this type of information? Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like on this broadcast. Share this on your social media platforms. Be sure to visit our website, TheAHNHistoryNetwork.com, TheAHNHistoryNetwork.com. You can register also for the online history classes that I teach. This week, the classes are going to be on Monday and Thursday, because I'm in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday. I'll be one of the political commentators on Roland Martin's 6-hour election day broadcast. Okay, so visit our website, TheAHNHistoryNetwork.com. When you scroll down, it has information about my radio show on Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And on Thursday, November 10th, 7 p.m. to 9 p.m., we're teaching another installment of Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. The class is going to be at least 10 weeks instead of 8 weeks. Okay. I've added some more sessions to it. And then from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968, Monday, November 7th, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. That class is going to be 10 or 11 sessions. So you can register for it here. The class is on sale $80, regularly $130. We have a bundle pack also. You can register for both classes for $130. We do the sessions live. All the sessions are archived and recorded. You can go back and watch them anytime. Even a year from now, 2 years from now, you still have full access to the class. You can go back and watch it. Okay. All right. So I want to go to this piece here dealing with the Virginia slave codes of 1705. And what happens in Virginia, the colony of Virginia, is going to be replicated in the other colonies. Once again, all these laws don't just come into existence all at the same time. Okay. This stuff has to be formulated. Okay, so this is from PBS.org, Public Broadcasting System, in their series, Africans in America, Africans in America, Virginia Slave Codes, 1705. So the status of Blacks in Virginia slowly changed over the last half of the 17th century, last half of the 1600s, after Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 in the colony of Virginia. The Black indentured servant with his hope of freedom, the Black indentured servant with his hope of freedom was increasingly being replaced by African slaves, In 1705, the Virginia General Assembly removed any lingering uncertainty about this terrible transformation. It made a declaration that would seal the fate of African Americans for generations to come. Okay, this is a crucial piece of history. These are the Virginia slave codes of 1705. Here's an excerpt of what they said. All servants imported and brought into the country who were not Christians in their native country shall be accounted and be slaves, All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves, because they did have Native American slaves also. We're going to talk about that as well. That's a piece of history that's not really talked about a lot. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within this dominion shall be held to be real estate. If any slave resists his master, correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction, the master shall be free of all punishment. The master shall be free of all punishment, as if such accident never happened. Okay, now that comes from the Casual Killing Act of 1669 in the colony of Virginia, and then that gets incorporated into the Virginia slave codes of 1705. Okay, we'll talk about that in just a minute. The Casual Killing Act of October 20th, 1669, which stated that if in correcting, disciplining a slave, if the master or the mistress accidentally killed the slave, okay, the African slave, they would not face legal consequences. Okay, it was, oops, did I do that? My bad. No legal consequences. All right. Now, the Virginia Slave Code of 1705, which would also serve as a model for other colonies, because once again, they're formulating this whole system. Okay. And just because one colony has a law doesn't mean it exists in the other colonies. You have 13 different colonies. They have different laws. So they have to, each colony has to adopt these laws. The law imposed harsh physical punishments since enslaved persons who did not own property could not be required to pay fines. It stated that slaves needed written permission to leave their plantation, that slaves found guilty of murder or rape would be hanged, that for robbing or any other major offense, the slave would receive 60 lashes with the whip and be placed in stocks where his or her ears would be cut off. Now, this is the Virginia slave codes of 1705. And that for minor offenses, such as associating with whites, slaves would be whipped, branded, or maimed. Whipped, branded, or maimed for minor offenses of associating with whites. Now, for the 17th century African slave in Virginia, disputes with a master could be brought before a court for judgment. That's in the 1600s, 17th century. But with the Virginia slave codes, what we're going to see is we're going to see the rights of African people being eradicated. They're slowly eroding their rights and creating the system of chattel slavery. With the slave codes of 1705, this is no longer the case. So in the 1600s, slaves in Virginia that had disputes with their master, they could take their master to court. The Virginia slave codes of 1705 changes that law. A slave owner who sought to break the most rebellious of slaves could now do so, knowing any punishment he inflicted, including death, would not result in even the slightest reprimand because of the Casual Killing Act of 1669 in the colony of Virginia that is incorporated into the Virginia slave codes of 1705. Okay, now this is a brief synopsis of the Virginia slave codes. Now this is from pbs.org, Public Broadcasting System. Okay, it's some good information, but it's something crucial that's missing from here. Okay, so let's look at this piece right here from, I want to look at, let's look at Encyclopedia Virginia, encyclopediavirginia.org. Okay, an act concerning servants and slaves. This is looking at the Virginia slave codes of 1705. Okay, just a second. Let me, because I'm flipping back and forth between Firefox and Google Chrome. Okay, where is that? We have it. I have it up here in Firefox. Okay, we're coming to this next. Just a second here. Where is that? Okay, let me just pull this up. This is an act concerning service. I want to look at specifically section 4. An act concerning servants and slaves. And they show they have primary documents here also. Okay, stand by. Okay, this is what I want right here. Oh no, that's not it. Hold on. Okay, let me go to the screen right here. Okay, an act concerning servants and slaves, 1705. Encyclopedia Virginia. This is encyclopediavirginia.org. Okay, so they have the primary documents here from the from 1705 and some other documents also. Okay, but this is what I want to focus on right here. Context. In an act concerning servants and slaves passed by the Virginia General Assembly in October 1705, Virginia's colonial government collects old and establishes new laws with regards to indentured servants and slaves. What happened here? Okay, just a second here. All right. In an act concerning servants and slaves passed by the General Assembly of Virginia General Assembly, in the session of October 1705, Virginia's colonial government collects old and establishes new laws with regards to indentured servants and slaves. So they have the full text of it here. I want to focus in on section 4. Section 4, Roman numeral 4. It says, and also be enacted by the authority aforesaid, and it is hereby enacted that all servants imported and brought into this country by sea or land who were not Christians in their native country, except Turks and Moors, M-O-O-R-S, except Turks and Moors in amity with Her Majesty and others that can make due proof of their being free in England or any other Christian country before they were shipped in order to transportation hither, be accounted and shall be slaves, and such be here bought and sold, notwithstanding a conversion to Christianity afterward. Okay. So what they're doing with the Virginia Slave Code of 1705, they're making a distinction between Negroes and Moors, because African Moors are exempt from the Virginia slave codes. See, this is why. So in the piece that I showed you from pbs.org, they don't show you like the full Virginia slave codes. But when you go look at the full Virginia slave codes, it shows in section 4, it shows that in Virginia, and they're going to start doing this in other colonies. This is after Bacon's Rebellion of 1676. They start using the term Negro for slaves, And the term Moor, as I showed you on page 40 in Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr., 6th edition, chapter 2, that was already being used, but now they're making a distinction between Negroes and Moors and the distinction in how they're treated. They go on to section 5. And be it enacted by the authority aforesaid, and it is hereby enacted that if any person or person shall hereafter import into this colony and here sell as a slave any person or persons that shall be a free man in any Christian country, island, or plantation, such importer or seller as aforesaid shall forfeit and pay to the party from whom the said free man shall recover his freedom double the sum for which the said free man was sold, to be recovered in any court of record within this colony according to the course of the common law, wherein the defendant shall not be admitted to plead in bar any act or statute for limitation of actions. Okay. Provided always, section 6, that a slave's being in England shall not be sufficient to discharge him of his slavery without other proof of his being manumitted there. Okay. So they're saying you have to have proof that you were freed in England. Otherwise, you can still be a slave here in the Virginia colony. All right. Okay, so read the rest of this here. This deals with the Virginia slave codes of 1705. It's called An Act Concerning Servants and Slaves, 1705. This is that Encyclopedia of Virginia, but they make a distinction in the Virginia slave codes between Negroes and Moors. All right, now I want to look at, okay, we did that, PBS, we did this one. Okay, now I want to look at this right here. We can look at, just a second here. We've got, okay, let's look at this Talking Points memo. There's an article from Talking Points memo that deals with this as well. If this 1780s Southern politician fought Islamophobia, we can too. Because they talk about the Moor Sundry Act of 1790 here, which I've talked about before, and they talk about the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. So let's look at this here. How's everybody doing? Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like. Also, if you like this type of information, you can support the African History Network, $ the AHN Show through Cash App, $ the AHN Show through Cash App, and through PayPal, paypal.me / the AHN Show. This helps us keep doing the research, stay on the air, keep broadcasting, pay some of the bills. When I go to Washington, D.C. On Tuesday, I have to pay my way there, so that helps, cover expenses because I'm flying there and flying back. And then also be sure to register for our online history classes also that we have going on this week. We'll post a link here for the courses, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Mahafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school, and from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. Okay, let's go back to this here. I want to go to this article here from Talking Points memo. If this 1780s Southern politician fought Islamophobia, we can too. Okay, this is from February 13th, 2015. here's what I want to focus in on. Okay, to talk about Islamophobia. Let's start at the beginning. They say, let's start at the beginning. By the time of the American Revolution, which is 1775 to 1783, a sizable Moroccan community known as Moors, in the language of the era, ERA, had developed in and around Charleston, South Carolina. Had developed in and around Charleston, South Carolina. Some of the community's members were likely former slaves, but many others had chosen to immigrate from Morocco, North Africa, with which the U.S. had a so-called Treaty of Friendship. Okay, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. Morocco indeed was the first African nation to recognize the United States during the American Revolution. Worried about being denied rights due to South Carolina's system of slavery, a group of Muslim Americans petitioned the state's courts requesting that they be recognized as white, A tribunal of judges led by prominent South Carolinian Charles Pinckney agreed with their petition, and the state legislature passed the Moor Sundry Act of 1790, designating this Moroccan Muslim American community white for purposes of the law. Okay, so this is the petition of the Free Sundry Moors of South Carolina, 1790, who did not want to, they wanted to make sure if for some reason they had to go to court, if they had to deal with legal issues, they wanted to make sure that they were not held to the standards of the Negro Act of 1740 in South Carolina. The Negro Act of 1740 in South Carolina, the colony of South Carolina, was put in place because as a result of what's known as the Stonewall Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina. Okay, so once again we see a distinction that's being made as this whole system is being formulated. We see a distinction being made between Negroes who are enslaved and Moors. It's let's see here. See, the impact of the Stonewall Rebellion. Let me see. And there's an article from alt.com on the Stonewall Rebellion, and also face-to-faceafrica.com. Let me see here. Hold on just a second. Let me pull this up. Okay, if we look at pbs.org, if we look at this from pbs.org, in just a second, let me refresh the screen here. This is acting up. Stand by. We're back. All right. So let's look at this from PBS.org on the Stono Rebellion of September 9th, 1739. This is a slave rebellion in South Carolina. We'll look at this briefly here. This is from Africans in America, PBS.org. Okay, South Carolina, September 9th, 1739, a band of African slaves marched down the road carrying banners that proclaim liberty. They shout out the same word, liberty, led by the Angolan named Jimmy, Jemmy. The men and women continued to walk south, recruiting African slaves along the way. By the time they stopped to rest for the night, their numbers will have approached 100. What exactly triggered the Stono Rebellion is not clear. Many Africans and slaves knew that small groups of runaways had made their way from South Carolina to Florida, where they had been given freedom and land. Looking to cause unrest within the English colonies, because this is before the American Revolutionary War. It doesn't start until 1775. So this is 1739. Looking to cause unrest within the English colonies, the Spanish had issued a proclamation stating that a slave who deserted to St. Augustine in Florida would be given the same treatment, Okay. Certainly, this influenced potential rebels. And made them willing to accept the situation. A fall epidemic had disrupted the colonial government in nearby Charleston, South Carolina, and word had just arrived that England and Spain were at war, raising hopes that the Spanish and St. Augustine would give a positive reception to African slaves escaping from Carolina plantations. But what may have actually triggered the Stono Rebellion on September 9th, 1739, was the soon-to-be enacted Security Act. In mid-August of 1739, a Charleston newspaper announced the Security Act. This was a response to whites' fears of insurrection. The act required that all white men carry firearms to church on Sundays, a time when whites usually did not carry weapons, and Africans who were enslaved were allowed to work for themselves. Okay, and Africans who were enslaved were allowed to work for themselves. Anyone who did not comply with the new law by September 29, 1739, would be subjected to a fine. Whatever triggered the Stono Rebellion early on the morning of September 9th, 1739, which was on a Sunday, about 20 Africans who were enslaved gathered near the Stono River in St. Paul's Parish, less than 20 miles from Charleston, South Carolina. The Africans went to a shop that sold firearms and ammunition. They armed themselves. Then they killed two shopkeepers who were manning the shop. From there, the band walked to the house of a Mr. Godfrey, where they burned the house and killed Mr. Godfrey and his son and daughter. They headed south. It was not yet dawn when they reached Wallace's Tavern. Because the innkeeper at the tavern was kind to his slaves, his life was spared. The white inhabitants of the next 6 or so houses that this rebellion reaches were not so lucky, and they were killed. The Africans belonging to the African slaves belonging to Thomas Rose successfully hid their master, but they were forced to join the rebellion. They would be rewarded later, okay? Other African slaves willingly joined the rebellion. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the group was about 50 strong. The few whites whom they now encountered were chased and killed, though one individual, Lieutenant Governor Bull, B-U-L-L, eluded the rebels and rode to spread the alarm. The African slaves stopped in a large field late that afternoon, just before reaching the Edosto River. They had marched over miles and killed between 20 and 25 whites. Around 4 in the afternoon, 4 p.m., somewhere between 20 and 100 whites had set out in armed pursuit. When they approached the rebels, the slaves fired 2 shots. The whites returned fire, bringing down 14 of the African slaves. By dusk, about 30 of these Africans were dead, and at least 30 had escaped. Most were captured over the next month, and then they were executed. The rest were captured over the following 6 months, all except one who remained a fugitive for 3 years. Uncomfortable with the increasing numbers of Africans for some time, the white colonists in the colony of South Carolina had been working on a Negro Act that would limit the privileges of African slaves. This act was quickly finalized and approved after the Stono Rebellion. So the Negro Act goes into effect in 1740, the year after the Stono Rebellion. No longer would African slaves be allowed to grow their own food, which they could prior to the Stono Rebellion, because as I explained to people, different colonies had different laws. Okay, a lot of let me put it like this. A lot of our concept of what slavery was is homogenized, and we think it was like the same in all the colonies. And this history evolves, and you have an erosion of their rights over time. And we see this erosion increasing in the early 1700s. And also you have an erosion of the rights of free African Americans as well, because free African Americans could vote in the 1600s going into the early 1700s in different colonies. And those different colonies start phasing that out. They start phasing out the ability of free African people to own land. Okay, now Moors were exempt from this. Okay, so the way we, like I said before, people think August 20th, 1619, those Africans on the White Lion pirate ship just step into a system that's already formulated. No, it's not. Codified slave laws didn't even exist in the 13 colonies. Chattel slavery didn't exist in the 13 colonies. No longer would African slaves be allowed to grow their own food, assemble in groups, earn their own money, which they could various ways prior to the Stono Rebellion, or learn to read, okay? Because even though we have the concept that it was illegal for slaves to learn to read and write during slavery, in some colonies prior to, in the 1600s, they could. And even in the state of Virginia after the American Revolutionary War, it was legal in Virginia up until 1831 for slaves to learn to read and write, even though most of the southern states, so a lot of the northern states, had abolished slavery by then. But a lot of the southern states, it was still illegal, like in the 1830s. But 1831, Virginia makes it illegal for slaves to be able to learn to read and write. What was significant about 1831? That's when you had the Nat Turner Rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia. And Nat Turner was literate. He could read and write, and he could read the Bible. After the Nat Turner Rebellion, after they execute Nat Turner and they round up the rebels, execute them, put them on trial, the ones that were not killed, and they execute Nat Turner, the state legislature in Virginia passes a law that makes it illegal to teach slaves to read and write. Okay, so no longer would African slaves be allowed to grow their own food, assemble in groups, earn their own money, or learn to read. Some of these restrictions had been in effect before the Negro Act, but had not been strictly enforced. Okay, so now the Negro Act of 1740 was the result of the Stoner Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina. So when you have the petition of the free sundry Moors in 1790, they want clarification, and they want to make sure that they are not held to the standard of the Negro Act of 1740. Okay, and the South Carolina State Legislature passes the Moor Sundry Act of 1790 in South Carolina, designating this Moroccan Muslim American community white for purposes of law. So they had all the rights that people classified as white had. They could sit on juries, they could carry guns, they could vote. They had all the rights that white people had. That law was as complicated as race in American history has always been. It allowed members of this community to be counted more fully for state population and federal representation purposes, because the first census is taken in 1790, as the census was created by the U.S. Constitution. So the first census is taken in 1790. It also gave the Muslim Americans the opportunity to vote, serve on juries, and to gain and enjoy the benefits of citizenship, even as Black Americans or African Americans were largely denied those rights, because they're making a separation between Negroes and Moors, and they're doing this with the laws. Okay, they're making a separation between Negroes and Moors, whereas we go back to page 40 of Lerone Bennett Jr.'s Before the Mayflower, chapter 2, 6th edition. Okay, we go back to that. He lays out how early on, and when Europeans got here, largely speaking, the Africans weren't referred to as Negroes. The first Blacks were called Blackamoors, Moors, Negers, Negers, and Negars, Negars. The word negro or negro, which is Spanish and Portuguese for black, or it could also mean a black thing, a Spanish and Portuguese term for black, did not come into general use in Virginia until the latter part of the 17th century, after Bacon's Rebellion of 1676. So this is why you have to look at this history chronologically. This is why a lot of these cookie cutter, a lot of these cookie cutter approaches to understanding slavery and the history of slavery in this country and the history laws in this country are not applicable, because that's not how it happened. That's why you have to understand the chronology of how all of this evolved. Okay, now let's go back to the article from Talking Points Memo. So the Moor Sundry Act of of 1790 in South Carolina designated the Moroccan Muslim American community white for purposes of the law. The law, it allowed members of this community to be counted more fully for state population and federal representation purposes. It also gave these Muslim Americans the opportunity to vote, serve on juries, and to gain and enjoy the benefits of citizenship, even as Black Americans or African Americans or African people were largely denied those same rights. The revolutionary history gets broader and deeper still. The only passage in the body of the Constitution, as drafted in 1787, that references religion at all is the paragraph in Article 6 that makes clear that, quote, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office, end quote. This profoundly progressive phrase, written in an era when every other constitutional government around the world featured an official state religion, was drafted by none other than Charles Pinckney. Okay. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina. After the Constitution was drafted, Charles Pinckney was tasked with taking it before the South Carolina state legislature for the state's ratification debate. During the debate, he was asked by one of the legislators about the exact Article 6 paragraph, and more exactly about whether it would mean that a Muslim could run for office in the United States. Charles Pinckney's answer was, yes, it does, and I hope to live to see it happen. Yes, it does, and I hope to live to see it happen. His words are inspiring and a challenge to those who say they believe in inclusion today. How many white Christian elected officials today say, quote, I hope to see more Muslim Americans elected, more Muslim Americans in elected office, the way Charles Pinckney did. Okay, read this full article here. This is from talkingpointsmemo.com. If this 1780s Southern politician fought Islamophobia, we can too. If this 1780s Southern politician fought Islamophobia, we can too. This is from February 13th, 2015 by Ben Railton, Railton, for Talking Points Memo. All right. Now, I got a couple more things and I have to get out of here. Okay, so we did that. We did an act concerning servants and slaves. Okay, let me go back to the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like on this broadcast. Also, be sure to register for my online history classes as well. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. And from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. Okay, how Bacon's rebellion planted the seeds of race-based slavery. This is an excerpt from the article that I showed you, Why America's First Colonial Rebels Burned Jamestown, Virginia to the Ground, from history.com. Planters feared what their white indentured servants could do, so they slowly eliminated the system of white indentured servitude, relying instead on enslaved African people to work their plantations. Backlash from Bacon's rebellion is credited with helping kick off the racial distinctions that defined the colonies and the United States that followed, because it's going to be after Bacon's rebellion that they institute the term white in the colony, starting with the colony of Virginia right around 16 81, and then it's going to spread throughout the other colonies. And they're trying to break up the alliance between enslaved African people and any African indentured servants. They're trying to break up that alliance between them and white indentured servants and poor Europeans. Okay, let me see here. Just a second, let's see where I left off. Okay. Okay, so you can read the rest of that. And this is also part of it here. In the aftermath of the rebellion, white planters reacted with alarm to the anger they had seen among the Black Virginians who had joined Bacon's rebellion. Quote, the planters had not been able to control this rowdy labor force of servants and slaves, historian Ira Berlin told PBS.org. Quote, but soon after Bacon's rebellion, they increasingly distinguished between people of African descent and people of European descent. They enact laws which say that people of African descent are hereditary slaves, end quote. They institute the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705, which then are adopted by versions of that are adopted by the other colonies. Okay. There was this good article here from the New York Times, and I talked about this when I spoke at the virtual environmental summit this past week. Black Native American and fighting for recognition in Indian country. Black Native American and fighting for recognition in Indian country. And this talks about a man named Ron Graham, whose ancestors are known as Creek freedmen. His ancestors were owned by the Creek Indians, because the Choctaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians all owned African slaves. And they were among the thousands of African Americans who were once enslaved by tribal members in the South and who immigrated to Oklahoma when their tribes were forced off their homelands and marched west in the 1830s. That's on the Trail of Tears. Okay, and they all go out west into Oklahoma, and about a third of the people on the Trail of Tears were African slaves, because the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians all own African slaves. And Tulsa, Oklahoma is going to be founded by Creek Indians around 1834. Okay, I have actually a 2.5-hour lecture that I've done dealing with the history of Black Wall Street and Tulsa, Oklahoma, all of that. So that's available at our website. This one here, Black Wall Street from Destruction to the Resurrection of Economic Empowerment. Okay, this one right here. We have it on DVD at our website, TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com, TheHistoryNetwork.com, as well as other lectures that there for my online. So, all right, why isn't this moving? Okay, there we go. This piece here, let's see here, where we're in the PowerPoint. Okay, let me go back to this article quickly. This is from the New York Times. Okay, in the treaty signed after the Civil War, which is 1861, 1865, they won freedom. These Africans who were slaves of these, what are known as the 5 civilized tribes of Native Americans, they won freedom and were promised tribal citizenship and an equal stake in the tribe's lands and fortunes. But what followed were broken promises, exclusions, and painful fights over whether tens of thousands of descendants should now be recognized as tribal members. Some of the descendants have won lawsuits seeking inclusion in the Cherokee Nation. Some gained nominal citizenship as Seminoles, Seminole Indians, Black Seminoles, but said they could not access tribal services. Others, like Ron Graham, have nothing. But now a landmark Supreme Court decision for tribal sovereignty has breathed new life into their fight. In July 2020, the Supreme Court recognized a huge portion of eastern Oklahoma as reservation land under the terms of an 1866 treaty. And these are the Black Freedmen Indian Treaties of 1866. The same treaty also guaranteed that freed African slaves and their descendants would, quote, have and enjoy all the rights and privileges of native citizens, end quote. Okay, so read the rest of that. They estimate there's about 160,000 descendants of those formerly enslaved bodies, Native American nations, these five. And I'm not saying all of the 566 federally recognized tribal nations owned slaves. We're talking about these. These are some of the largest, what are known as the 5 civilized tribes of Native Americans: the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians. Okay, read this. And then also, now what's interesting is that I've talked about this before. You have well, number one, a lot of the early African American landowners in Tulsa, Oklahoma, got land from these Indian treaties and the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887. Read this article here: 9 entrepreneurs who helped build Tulsa's Black Wall Street. This is from history.com, official website of the History Channel, May 14th, 2021. Quote, their relative wealth, the relative wealth of some Black folks in Oklahoma comes in part through their connection to the tribes, to these Native American nations, and their land ownership, says Hannibal B. Johnson, historian and author of Black Wall Street 100, and American City grapples with its historical racial trauma. The Dawes Allotment Act of 1887, named after Senator Henry L. Dawes of Massachusetts, authorized the government to divide tribal territories into allotments for individual Native Americans. So the majority of that land was supposed to go to Native Americans and Black Indians, okay? And white people ended up getting 2/3 of the land. This is where you get the term the $5 Indian from, because white people found out about this land giveaway, and you had to anglicize your name to get added to the Dawes rolls, which is like a census, okay? $5 to have their names added to the Dawes rolls, so they can get it also. And they ended up, it's 138 million acres of land. White people got 2/3 of this land. Okay, so the Dawes Act 1887 authorized the government to divide tribal territories into allotments for individual Native Americans, which included Black members. As word spread that Indian Territory was a safe place for African Americans to settle, between 1865 and 1920, more than 50 Black townships were founded in Oklahoma, including in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay. So read this article here from Hannibal B. Johnson. I read Hannibal B. Johnson's first book on Black Wall Street, which is this one right here, Black Wall Street from Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's historic Greenwood District. So this is one of my sources for my lecture, my 2.5-hour lecture dealing with the history of Black Wall Street and the origins of Tulsa, Oklahoma also. And I deal with a timeline of history leading up to the attack June 1st, 1921 as well. Okay, there was the Casual Killing Act of 1669. You can check this out. This is from Equal Justice Initiative. Brian Stevenson's organization. October 20th, 1669, Colonial Virginia. Authorizes enslavers to kill rebellious slaves. Hold on. Colonial Virginia authorizes enslavers. Okay, EJ. All right, here we go. October 20th, 1669, colonial Virginia authorizes enslavers to kill rebellious slaves. The Virginia Colonial Assembly, October 20th, 1669, enacted a law that removed criminal penalties for enslavers who killed enslaved people resisting authority. The assembly justified the law on the grounds that the obstinacy of many enslaved people cannot be suppressed by other than violent means, by violent means. The law provided that an enslaver's killing of an enslaved person could not constitute murder because the premeditated malice element of murder could not be formed against one's own property. In subsequent years, Virginia continued to reduce legal protections for enslaved people. In 1723, the assembly removed all penalties for the killing of enslaved people during correction, meaning that an enslaved person could be killed for any offense as minor as picking bad tobacco. The willful or malicious killing of an enslaved person could constitute murder in theory, but the law excused the killing of an enslaved person if the killing was in any way provoked. In effect, enslavers could kill enslaved people with impunity in colonial era Virginia, and the situation was similar in most other colonial territories. Following the American Revolution, many states created penalties for killing enslaved people, but the loophole permitting the killing of an enslaved person during correction or to prevent resistance remained. As a result, throughout the course of slavery in this country's history, enslavers were rarely punished for killing enslaved people. Okay, so read this here. Colonial Virginia authorizes enslavers to kill rebellious slaves. This is from EJI.org, Equal Justice Initiative. Also, check out the history of the idea of race at Britannica.com. They have some good information there as well. That was one of my slides that I did in my presentation at the conference this past week. That was one of my sources. The idea of the history of race from Britannica.com. And probably a new, okay, yeah, they deal with indentured servitude, all of that. By the mid-17th century, mid-1600s, a wealthy few had encumbered virtually all lands not under Indian control, and were attempting to work these lands using indentured servants. The working poor, as those eventually freed from servitude, had little on which to survive, and their dissatisfaction with the inequities of colonial society led to riots and numerous threats of revolt. After 1619, this group of poor servants, including many Africans and their descendants, some of whom had experience in Spanish and Portuguese colonies, where slave labor was widely used. Okay, so read this also. So I don't have time to get deep into that. That was in one of the slides. Okay, now very briefly here, King Philip's War of 1675, 1676 in the colony of New England. This is going on basically at the same time as Bacon's Rebellion. Okay, and this is something that I dealt with because I panel dealing with Native Americans and African Americans at the conference, the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition Virtual 2020 Equity Summit. It took place Wednesday, November 2nd through Friday, November 4th. Okay, let me go to this information here dealing with right here. Colonial enslavement of Native Americans included those who were surrendered. So the history of Native Americans being enslaved is not really talked about a lot. Native American slavery is a piece of history of slavery that has been glossed over, said Linford D. Fisher, associate professor of history at Brown University. He said, quote, between 1492 and 1880, between 2 million and 5.5 million Native Americans were enslaved in the Americas, in addition to 12.5 million African slaves. Now, it's also important to note, and I deal with this in the class, we know that the first Americans were Africans, documented evidence. Dr. David Imhotep's book, there was an African presence here going back at least 51,700 years ago. Those were the Khoisan, who come from Southern Africa. We know African Moors were here as well. And also we know that there are going to be groups of Africans that get reclassified as Native Americans where European settlers come here also. Captain John Smith, page 66, 65, 66 of this book, he talks about how Captain John Smith said he was captured by a group of Black Indians in 1607 in Virginia. So you had this African presence here as well, and some of those Africans get reclassified as Native Americans by European settlers. Now, while natives had been forced into slavery and servitude as early as 1636, it was not until King Philip's War that natives were enslaved in large numbers. Associate Professor Linford Fisher wrote in the study. The 1675-1676 war, King Philip's War, pitted Native American leader King Philip, also known as Metacom, Metacom, and his allies against the English colonial settlers. This is in the colony of New England. During the war, New England colonies routinely shipped Native Americans as slaves to Barbados, which we know was a British colony, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica. And Jamaica, it starts out as a Spanish colony in 1494, conquered by Columbus, but then becomes a British colony. Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, the Azores, Spain, and Tangier in North Africa, Associate Professor of History Linford Fisher said. While Africans who were enslaved did not know where they would be taken, Native Americans understood that they could be sent to Caribbean plantations and face extremely harsh treatment far from their homes and communities, according to the study. Fear of this fate spurred some Native Americans to pledge to fight to the death, while others surrendered, hoping to avoid being sent overseas, the study found. Now, Professor Linford Fisher's study entitled "Why Shall We Have Peace to Be Made Slaves, Indian Surrenderers During and After King Philip's War." This study appears in the journal Ethnohistory, a volume devoted to scholarship on indigenous slavery in the New World. Native American enslavement was documented in colonial correspondence, shipping records, court cases, town records, colonial government orders, and petitions from colonists to the British government. So this is at brown.edu. This article is from February 15th, 2017. Colonial enslavement of Native Americans included those who surrendered too. So at the same time of King Philip's War was raging in the colony of New England. You had Bacon's Rebellion in the colony of Virginia that I already talked about. All right. So hopefully you learned a lot from this broadcast, this history lesson. This is some of the information that I presented at the environmental conference this past week, and I did not get a chance to, because there were so many people on the panel, they were short on time. The session was only like an hour and 15 minutes. I didn't get a chance to get deep into this information like I was able to get into it today. Okay, be sure, if you like this type of information, give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like on this broadcast. Be sure to register for my online history classes, okay? This helps support the African History Network. This helps finance the research, helps us stay on the air, keep broadcasting, pay some of the bills, helps when I have to pay the troll, because Tuesday, November 8th, I'll be one of the political commentators for Roland Martin Unfiltered for their 6-hour broadcast, Election Day broadcast. It's 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Okay, we'll have information on our website also, TheAHNShow.com. But visit our website, TheAHNShow.com, and you can register for the online history classes I teach. So this week, because I'll be out of town this week, we'll have class on Monday. We'll have class on Monday and Thursday. Thursday is going to be Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. We deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. Some of the slides I showed you, some of those slides are from the class also. That's going to be 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Thursday, November 10th. Okay, we do the sessions live. All the sessions are archived and recorded. You can watch them on demand anytime. The class is on sale, $80, regularly $130. Click right here, register here to register for the class. And then, and that's going to be a 10-week class. We may do 11 weeks. And the class I teach on this week, this class is going to be on Monday, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. Monday, November 7th, we'll do 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Normally the classes are Tuesdays and Wednesdays, but this week, since I'm out of town, I have to change the schedule. And we deal with history starting in 1800, and we go through, look at history, what leads to the Civil War taking place, Mexican-American War, 1846, 1848, Missouri Compromise, 1820, Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, Civil War, Reconstruction, Great Migration, Jim Crow era, World War I, World War II, Civil Rights Movement, Black Power Movement. Okay, so it's a fantastic class also. And we have a bundle pack. You can register for both classes. This is the best value. Register for both classes for $130. Click right here to register here. And there's bonus content that you get. So it's over $300 value. There's bonus content you're going to get also. You can use this information with your children. I would say the content is PG-13. Okay, you can use this information with your children as well. And if you have any questions, you can email us, TheAHNShow@TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com, or email us through the website as well, TheAHNShow@TheAfricanHistoryNetwork.com. And we also have the information for PayPal and Cash App at our website also. So if you want to support us that way, you can also. This is our official Cash App account, $ TheAHNShow, SHOW. When you go to it, it'll say Michael. Okay, these other ones here, and the 5 I've identified a fake African History Network Cash App account. You click right here, it takes you to the barcode, the scan, the QR code, so you can scan that also. All right, and we have the link for PayPal here also. Okay, we have to get out of here. Be sure to follow us on our fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network, and our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP. And listen to the African History Network show Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on 9:10 a.m. Superstation WFDF. And we have the information on the homepage of our website as well. And the land back movement, this is something that we were talking about at the conference. The land back movement, you may have seen commercials for it. This is from landback.org. This is a Native American movement. Land back is a movement that has existed for generations with a long legacy of organizing and sacrifice to get indigenous lands back to indigenous hands. to get indigenous lands back to indigenous hands. Currently, there are land back battles being fought all across Turtle Island, which is one of the original names for this land we call the United States of America. Turtle Island. Even in the first Americans were Africans documented evidence, he talks about Dr. David Imhotep talks about Turtle Island. To the north and the south. Okay, currently there are land back battles being fought all across Turtle Island to the north and the south. The Indian collective, we are stepping into this legacy with the launch of a land back campaign as a mechanism to connect, coordinate, resource, and amplify this movement and the communities that are fighting for land back. The closure of Mount Rushmore, return of that land and all public lands in the Black Hills, South Dakota, is our cornerstone battle from which we will build out this campaign. Not only does Mount Rushmore sit in the heart of the sacred Black Hills, but it is an international symbol of white supremacy and colonization. To truly dismantle white supremacy and systems of oppression, we have to go back to the roots, which for us is putting indigenous lands back in indigenous hands. Okay, read the rest of this here. Okay, this is at landback.org. Okay, landback.org. All right, look, I have to get out of here. Remember, right now is correct. Wrong behavior is not over till we win. Wakanda forever. Be sure to register for the classes. We'll see you in class this week, and listen to the African History Network show. Follow us on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP. Turn on live notifications so you know when we go live. And follow us on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network. Turn on live notifications so you know when we go live there. Okay? Talk to you next time. Peace.